My name is Maria. For 40 years I have lived as a phantom in the grand hallways of this university. A shadow that moves only when the world is looking the other way. My hands are not soft. They are a map of labor, etched with the deep, permanent grooves of every floor I've polished and every footprint I've scrubbed away. I have spent a lifetime making the stage perfect for others, all while remaining tucked behind the heavy curtain of invisibility. In the eyes of the world I was just a function, a blue smock, a bucket of gray water. But today, I am sharing my heart with you because I finally learned that the greatest revenge isn't anger. It is the quiet, powerful act of reclaiming the dignity the world tried to take from you. Before we step into this story, I want to offer you my deepest, most humble thanks. In a world that often moves too fast to care, the fact that you have stopped to listen to a woman like me is a gift I do not take lightly. If these words find a home in your heart today, I invite you to subscribe to Queen's Revenge. We aren't just telling stories. We are building a sanctuary for the unseen and a voice for the forgotten. Please join our community. Let us remind the world together that no matter where you stand, whether in the shadows or the spotlight, your soul carries a light that no one can extinguish. This is my story. This is our journey. The silence of the university at 4 in the morning is not a void. It is a weight. It is a heavy velvet shroud that settles over the grand marble foyers and the narrow, linoleum-lined arteries of the lecture halls, pressing against my eardrums until I can hear the frantic rhythm of my own aging heart. In this stillness, before the sun dares to bleed across the horizon, I am the only pulse in a gargantuan body of stone and scholarship. My world is defined by the margins, the hours before the first caffeine-fueled student stumbles into a 101-level seminar, and the hours after the last ambitious professor extinguishes their desk lamp. I exist in the seams of time, a phantom tethered to a mop bucket. My day does not begin with the chirping of birds or the soft warmth of light. It begins with the sharp, clinical bite of industrial ammonia and the rhythmic, metallic clatter of my trolley. This is my orchestra. The squeak of rubber wheels against polished floors is my woodwind section. The heavy, wet thwack of a mop hitting the ground is my percussion. I call it the symphony of dust. It is a performance played for no one. A nightly ritual of erasure where I scrub away the vestiges of lives I will never lead. I look down at my hands as I wring the gray water from the heavy cotton fibers. They are no longer the hands of the girl who once dreamt of painting the sunflowers in the valley back home. They are cartographies of labor, mapped with blue, bulging veins and calloused ridges that have forgotten the texture of silk, knowing only the rough grit of scouring pads. My knuckles are swollen, permanent monuments to the damp cold of winter mornings. Every movement is a negotiation with pain. My knees, long ago surrendered to the relentless demand of hard surfaces, sing a low, throbbing melody of protest with every step. Yet there is a quiet, stubborn dignity in this pain. It is the price of my invisibility, the toll I pay to remain a ghost in the machine of this great institution. As I move through the long corridor of the humanities building, my footsteps echo like a heartbeat in a hollow chest. I stop before the glass-encased portraits of the university's founders. They look out with stern obsidian eyes, their legacies carved in granite. I wonder if they ever spared a thought for the ones who keep their glass smudge-free. Probably not. To be essential is often to be invisible. If I do my job perfectly, no one notices I was ever there. The floors simply shine, the air simply smells of lemon, and the chalkboards are miraculously black again, ready for the next set of equations or existential questions. I am the invisible hand that resets the world every 24 hours. I enter a lecture hall, room 302. The air still heavy with the lingering scent of stale coffee and the frantic energy of 100 different ambitions. I see the footprints. They are everywhere. Scuff marks from expensive leather loafers, mud tracked in by heavy hiking boots, the delicate imprints of fashionable flats. These are the footprints of those destined for greater things. They belong to the future doctors, the upcoming lawyers, the architects of tomorrow. They walk with a weightlessness I can barely remember, their strides long and confident because the world has promised them a destination. I, however, have no destination. I only have the return. I follow their paths with my mop, a silent sentinel cleaning up after their progress. I find myself apologizing to the empty chairs as I move between the rows. "Excuse me," I whisper to a phantom student as I wipe a coffee ring from their desk. I am the eraser of their existence, the one who removes the evidence of their struggle, so they can start anew the next morning. There is a profound loneliness in being the caretaker of other people's dreams, while your own have long since turned to ash. The physical toll of these years is not just in the joints, it is in the soul. It is the way I have learned to lower my gaze when I pass a mirror, no longer recognizing the woman with the weary eyes and the silver-streaked hair tucked tightly under a functional bandana. It is the way I have learned to make myself small, to press myself against the walls when a group of boisterous students passes by, becoming as inanimate as the statues in the courtyard. I have mastered the art of being a shadow. I have learned to find a strange, melancholy peace in the shadows, where the world doesn't expect anything from me other than my labor. Sometimes in the quietest moments I find a stray scrap of paper on the floor, a discarded poem, a frantic note about a chemistry formula, a doodle of a heart with 2 names inside. I hold these fragments of their lives with a reverence they would find baffling. To them it is trash. To me it is a telegram from a world of possibility. I tuck a particularly beautiful line of verse into my pocket, a tiny stolen ember to keep me warm in the cold, cavernous silence of the night. As the clock on the tower strikes 5, I feel the familiar ache in my lower back blooming into a sharp, insistent sting. I lean against my mop handle for a moment, closing my eyes. In the darkness, I can almost hear the university breathing, the hum of the ventilation, the settling of the old stones. It is a magnificent place, a cathedral of knowledge. And I am its most humble servant. I do not resent the students for their bright futures, nor do I envy the professors for their intellect. My heart is too tired for such heavy emotions. Instead, I feel a weary acceptance. This is my place in the grand design. I am the one who ensures the stage is clean for the actors, even if I am never allowed to step into the spotlight. The first hint of gray light begins to filter through the high, arched windows, turning the dust motes into dancing points of silver. My symphony is nearing its finale. The floors are polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the pale, early light. The trash is gone, the air is crisp, and the silence is beginning to fray at the edges as the city wakes up. I gather my things, my movements slow and deliberate. My shift is ending, but my invisibility remains. I will walk out the back exit just as the world begins to rush in through the front. I will return to my small, quiet room where the only symphony is the ticking of a clock and the sound of my own breath. I will sleep while the world achieves, and I will wake when the world sleeps, ready to return to the shadows, ready to pick up my mop and begin the symphony of dust once more. For in the eyes of the world I am just Maria, the cleaning lady. But in the quiet of the dawn I know the truth. I am the guardian of the sanctuary. And though I am unseen, my labor is the quiet heartbeat of this place. A testament to the dignity of a life spent in the service of others, even when the others have forgotten how to see me. The alarm clock on my bedside table doesn't ring. It gasps. It is a weary mechanical sound that mirrors the state of my own lungs in the damp chill of the early morning. I reach out a hand, my fingers stiff and unyielding, to silence the plastic intruder. 4:15. The numbers glow a malevolent electronic green, marking the start of another cycle of erasure. But today, the silence that follows the click of the alarm feels heavier, thicker with a secret I try to keep even from myself. Today is the 14th of October. Today, I am 64 years old. I lie still for a moment, staring at the cracked plaster of the ceiling, where the shadows of the streetlights outside dance like ghosts. I acknowledge the date only in the deepest, most silent chamber of my heart, a place I rarely visit because the air there is too thin and the memories too sharp. In that room there is a small dusty cake with a single candle that never goes out, and a girl in a floral dress who still believes in magic. But I am not that girl. I am Maria, the woman who knows that expecting a celebration is merely a sophisticated way of inviting disappointment into one's home. Life has a way of scouring the hope out of you, much like the way I scour the grime from the university sinks. It starts with the small things, a forgotten anniversary, a phone that stops ringing, a seat at a table that is no longer set. Eventually, you learn to stop looking at the calendar. You learn that a day is just a container for labor, and the sun rising is simply a signal to begin again. I attempt to sit up, and the symphony of my joints begins its morning performance. This is my only birthday gift, a visceral, stinging reminder of the years I have carried. My lower back let out a sharp electric protest, A jagged line of pain that reminds me of the thousands of miles I have walked on concrete. My knees crack with the sound of dry kindling snapping underfoot. It is the language of attrition. Each ache is a notch on a tally stick, a record of every bucket carried and every stair climbed. Happy birthday, Maria. My bones seem to creak. Here is the weight of another year for you to shoulder. I swing my legs over the side of the bed, my feet finding the cold linoleum floor. I do not turn on the main light. The dimness is kinder to the reflection in the cracked mirror above my dresser. In the shadows, the deep furrows around my mouth look like mere ripples on water, and the silver in my hair looks like moonlight rather than the ash of a life spent in the background. I trace the line of my jaw, feeling the fragility of the skin. I look like a map that has been folded and unfolded too many times, the creases permanent and deep. I remember briefly the birthdays of my youth. The smell of fresh bread and the wild lavender my mother would tuck behind my ear. There was a time when this date felt like a threshold, a doorway into a room full of light. Now it is just a wall, a flat gray expanse that I must paint over with the dull colors of my routine. I pull on my uniform, the heavy blue polyester smock that smells faintly of bleach and old water. It is my armor. When I button it up, the woman named Maria disappears, and the cleaning lady takes her place. I tuck my hair under the bandana, hiding the evidence of my aging. I check my pockets, my keys, my identification card, and a small folded piece of paper, a discarded sketch I found in the library weeks ago. It is a drawing of a bird in flight, its wings wide and defiant. I carry it not because I believe I can fly, but because it reminds me that something in this world is capable of it. I move to the small kitchenette to make tea. The kettle whistles, a shrill, lonely sound that pierces the quiet of the apartment. I drink the tea standing up, staring out the window at the empty street. I see my reflection in the dark glass, a pale smudge against the night. I find myself searching for a sign, a flicker of something different in the air. A part of me, the stubborn childlike part that refuses to die, whispers that perhaps today, the world will remember. Perhaps someone will look at me and see more than the blue smock in the mop bucket. Perhaps the professor will offer a nod that lasts a second longer. Or a student will offer a smile that isn't just a polite reflex. I immediately bury that hope. I push it down deep into the cellar of my mind and lock the door. Hope is a dangerous thing for a woman like me. It makes the disappointment cut deeper when it inevitably arrives. I steel my heart, wrapping it in layers of indifference. I tell myself that I do not need a cake. I do not need a song. I do not need to be seen. I have my work. I have the silence. I have the dignity of my own endurance. I finish my tea and wash the cup, drying it meticulously before placing it back in the cupboard. I put on my worn coat and pick up my bag. As I reach for the door handle, I pause. Just for a heartbeat. I look back at the dark, empty room. Happy birthday, Maria. I whisper into the stillness. My voice sounds small, like a dry leaf skittering across a pavement. There is no answer. I step out into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind me with a finality that feels like a sentence. I walk down the stairs, each step a dull thud in the quiet building. Outside, the air is biting, a precursor to the winter that is surely coming. I pull my collar up and begin the long walk to the university. I walk past the closed shops and the sleeping houses, a solitary figure moving through the gray dawn. I am going to room 302. I am going to erase the footprints of the living. I am going to perform my symphony of dust. And if my heart feels a little heavier today, if the ache in my joints feels a little more like a betrayal, I will not show it. I will keep my head down. I will keep my hands busy. I will remain the ghost they expect me to be. Because in this world, the invisible do not get birthdays. They only get more shadows to inhabit. The wrought iron gates of the university stand like the sentinels of a kingdom I am permitted to enter, but never to inhabit. As I pass through them, the transition is instantaneous. Behind me lies the gray, slumbering city of the tired and the forgotten. Before me lies an ivory tower of gilded potential. The air here even smells different. It is infused with the scent of expensive espresso, the crispness of new paper, and the intoxicating invisible perfume of a future that has never known the bite of a winter without heat. I am in their world, but I am not of it. I am the background radiation of their success, A constant, low-frequency presence that they have learned to tune out with the practiced ease of a scholar ignoring a distant hum. I stand at the edge of the great quadrangle, my hand gripping the handle of my trolley with a white-knuckled intensity. The morning rush has begun. It is a tidal wave of youth, a cacophony of vibrant colors and effortless motion. I watch them, the students. They move with an effervescence that makes my own limbs feel like they are fashioned from cooling lead. They walk with their heads held high, their eyes fixed on horizons I cannot see. Their laughter is bright and jagged, cutting through the morning air like a diamond across glass. They speak in the shorthand of the privileged, references to internships, summer trips to the coast, and the high-stakes drama of midterm exams that, to them, seem like the weight of the world. To me, their weight of the world looks like a feather. I observe them from the periphery, anchored to the shadows cast by the ancient oaks. I see a girl, perhaps no older than 20, leaning against a stone pillar. Her skin is like unblemished cream, her hair a waterfall of silk that has never been tucked under a polyester bandana. She holds a leather-bound textbook to her chest as if it were a sacred relic. Her hands, I cannot stop looking at her hands. They are soft, the nails manicured into perfect pale almonds. They are hands meant for turning pages, for holding pens, for gesturing toward grand ideas during a lecture. They are hands that have never known the stinging heat of a scouring pad, or the soul-crushing weight of a saturated mop. I look down at my own hands, resting on the cold, gray plastic of my cart. The contrast is a tectonic shift, a chasm so wide it could swallow my entire history. My skin is the color of old parchment, mapped with 1,000 tiny fissures from the relentless assault of bleach and lye. My fingernails are short, jagged, and perpetually stained with the gray ghosts of the dust I chase. These are hands that have spent 40 years in a state of servitude, wringing out the filth of others so they might walk on floors that shine like mirrors. The divide is not just in the skin, it is in the very bones. Their hands hold the keys to the future. Mine hold the tools to preserve the past. A group of boys walks past me, their conversation a blur of technical jargon and easy confidence. They don't see me. Not really. I am a part of the architecture, a blue-smocked gargoyle that happens to move. One of them accidentally brushes against my trolley, his expensive backpack snagging on a hook. He detaches it with a distracted sorry, his eyes never once meeting mine. He isn't being cruel. He is simply operating in a reality where I don't exist as a human being. I am a function. I am a service. I am the cleaning lady. The sorry hangs in the air, a hollow tinny sound. It is a word offered to an obstacle, not a person. I feel a familiar sharp sting in the center of my chest, the ache of being erased in plain sight. On this day, my 64th birthday, the erasure feels like a physical wound. I want to reach out and touch his sleeve to say, I have a name. I have a story. I have a birthday. But the words die in my throat, strangled by the decades of silence I have cultivated for my own survival. I begin to push my cart toward the humanities building. The squeak of the wheels a jarring counterpoint to the harmony of the students' lives. I enter the foyer, and the polished marble catches the morning light, reflecting a world of symmetry and grace. I look at my reflection in the floor, a distorted blue smudge moving across the white expanse. I am the only blemish on this perfect surface. My job is to ensure that even my own footprints are removed by the time the first class begins. As I move through the halls, I see the posters on the walls, lectures on ethics, seminars on the human condition, debates on the nature of justice. I find a bitter irony in it. They study the human condition in these rooms, while the woman scrubbing their toilets is a ghost they wouldn't recognize if they passed her 10 times a day. They talk about memenousiacan minutia, humanizing humans, as a philosophical concept. They don't realize that for someone like me, being humanized is a luxury I haven't been afforded in years. I arrive at the door of room 302. I stand there for a moment, the heavy wood a barrier between my gray reality and the vibrant world of the classroom. Inside, the students will soon gather to listen to the professor, a man whose intellect is revered, a man who commands the attention of everyone in the room. I am the one who prepares his stage. I am the one who ensures the chalk is replenished, and the desk is wiped clean of the previous day's failures. I push the door open. The room is empty, the air still and expectant. I see the rows of desks, the chairs waiting to be filled with the weight of the elite. I begin my work. I start at the back, moving toward the front. My mop leave a trail of damp, dark lines on the floor. I am the shadow in the light, the silence in the noise, the gray in the world of color. Every stroke of the mop is a reminder of the chasm. Every bucket of dirty water is a testament to the divide. I am in their world, breathing their air, cleaning their messes, but I am miles away, lost in a sea of invisibility. And as I work, the small buried hope from this morning begins to flicker and die, extinguished by the cold, hard reality of the polished divide. I am Maria, and today I am simply the woman who mops the floor. The rhythm of my labor is a fragile thing, a thin thread of sanity woven from the repetitive motions of scrubbing and wiping. It was nearly 10 in the morning, the university now a roaring hive of intellectual pursuit, when the silence of my internal world was shattered by the harsh, metallic crackle of the walkie-talkie clipped to my belt. The sound was a jagged tear in the fabric of my invisibility. "Maria, come in." "Maria, do you copy?" The voice of my supervisor, Mr. Henderson, was devoid of warmth, a dry rattle that always preceded a demand. I fumbled with the device, my damp, gloved fingers slipping against the plastic. "Yes, I am here, Mr. Henderson," I whispered, my voice sounding like a ghost even to myself. "Report to the Humanities Building immediately. Room 302. Professor Aris is requesting assistance. He says it's urgent. Get a move on." The radio went dead with a final dismissive pop. I stood frozen in the middle of the hallway, the heavy mop handle still clutched in my hand like a staff. Urgent. The word echoed in my mind, a cold, heavy stone dropping into the pit of my stomach. In my world, urgent never meant a promotion or a thank you. It was a word reserved for disasters. A shattered glass of wine in a faculty lounge, a flooded restroom, or a spilled inkpot on a priceless manuscript. Or worse, it was the precursor to a reprimand, the sharp edge of a tongue lashing out at a smudge I had failed to see, a corner I had neglected to sweep. My heart began a frantic, uneven dance against my ribs. I felt the familiar weight of anxiety settling over my shoulders, a heavy, invisible cloak. On this day of all days, my 64th year of existence, the thought of a confrontation felt unbearable. I was already so tired. The ache in my lower back had evolved from a dull throb into a sharp, insistent staccato, and the news of an urgent summons made my knees feel like they were made of water. I began to gather my tools, moving with a frantic, desperate efficiency. I checked my trolley. The bleach, the ammonia, the rolls of industrial paper towels, the yellow caution, wet floor sign. These were my shields, my only defense against the chaos of the world. If there was a spill, I would erase it. If there was a mess, I would make it vanish. I would do what I had always done. I would fix the world so they wouldn't have to look at its imperfections. As I pushed my cart toward the Humanities Building, the hallways felt longer, the ceilings higher, the gaze of the statues more judgmental. I felt like a criminal being led to the gallows, mentally rehearsing an apology for a fault I hadn't yet committed. "I'm so sorry, Professor. I must have missed it. It won't happen again. I'll stay late to fix it." The words were a bitter mantra, a script written by decades of being the one who was always by default to blame. I thought of Professor Aris. He was a man of immense stature in this institution, a figure of commanding presence and sharp, uncompromising intellect. I had seen him many times, usually from the safety of a shadow, his voice booming through the halls as he discussed the intricacies of ethics and human rights. To him, I was surely nothing more than a part of the plumbing, necessary, but entirely beneath notice. The idea that I had somehow offended his sensibilities or disrupted his sanctuary sent a fresh wave of panic through me. I arrived at the door of room 302, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I paused, resting my forehead against the cool, dark wood of the door. I could hear the murmur of voices inside, his voice and the softer, higher tones of the students. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. I closed my eyes for a second, a silent plea for strength rising from the quietest chamber of my heart. Just be invisible, Maria, I told myself. Accept the blame. Clean the mess. Disappear. I took a deep breath, the scent of my own anxiety mingling with the faint smell of bleach on my gloves. I gripped the handle, turned it and pushed. The door groaned on its hinges, a slow, heavy sound that felt like the opening of a tomb. I stepped into the light of the classroom, my head bowed, my gaze fixed firmly on the floor, waiting for the first blow of words to fall. I was a servant in a hall of kings, a ghost summoned to the feast, ready to apologize for the very air I breathed. The heavy oak door of room 302 swung open with a groan that seemed to announce my intrusion to the entire world. I stepped inside, my head instinctively tucked low, my shoulders hunched as if to deflect the weight of 100 gazes. I had expected a scene of academic chaos, a spilled thermos of coffee, or perhaps the muddy aftermath of a rainy trek across the quad. Instead, I was met with a wall of silence so profound it felt like a physical barrier. The lecture hall was not empty. It was a sea of bright, expectant eyes, a gallery of youth and intellect frozen in a moment of unsettling stillness. The air was thick with the scent of old books, expensive perfumes, and the electric hum of 100 laptops. And there, at the center of this universe, stood Professor Eris. He was a monument of academic authority, his stature imposing, his eyes sharp behind silver-rimmed spectacles that caught the fluorescent light. He did not speak at first. He simply looked at me, and for a terrifying second, I felt the full weight of my existence. The blue smock, the cracked shoes, the bucket of gray water. I was a smudge of charcoal on a pristine canvas. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he gestured toward the floor in the center of the room. I did not question him. I did not ask what had been spilled or why the task was so urgent that it required an audience of the university's brightest minds. In my world, questions are a luxury reserved for those whose time has value. For me, there is only the command and the execution. I moved toward the spot he indicated. The wheels of my trolley let out a rhythmic metallic protest that seemed loud enough to shatter the glass in the windows. I reached the center of the room, feeling the heat of 100 stairs burning into the back of my neck. I dipped the heavy cotton mop into the bucket, the familiar stinging scent of industrial ammonia rising to meet me, the scent of erasure, the smell of my life. I squeezed the lever, the wet thwack of the mop hitting the floor echoing through the silent hall. And then I began the rhythm. Back and forth, side to side. The mop moved with a grace that my own body had long ago forgotten. It was an extension of my arms, a wooden and cotton limb that knew the secrets of every floor in this building. I focused entirely on the linoleum, watching the damp, dark lines bloom under the mop and then slowly begin to fade as the air reclaimed them. I tried to become the mop. I tried to become the bucket. I tried to become a piece of furniture, something necessary, something functional, something that did not require a soul. I could feel the students watching me. To them, I was a curiosity, a living exhibit of a life they would never have to understand. I imagined their thoughts. How many years has she been doing this? Does she have a home? Does she have a name? Or perhaps more likely they weren't thinking of me at all. I was just a delay in their lecture, a minor technical glitch in their pursuit of knowledge. I lowered my gaze even further, my bandana-covered head almost touching my chest. I made myself small, shrinking into the blue polyester of my uniform. I wanted to disappear into the very floor I was cleaning. There is a specific kind of safety in being ignored. As long as you are part of the background, you cannot be hurt. I clutched the mop handle tighter, my swollen knuckles aching with the effort. The rhythm of servitude is a hypnotic thing. Scrub, rinse, ring. Scrub, rinse, ring. It is a penance I pay for the crime of being born into the shadows. I thought of the footprints I was erasing, the invisible marks of their frantic, important lives. I was the silent witness to their progress, the one who ensured that the stage was always reset, always perfect, always ready for their next great act. I moved a few paces to the left, my movements practiced and efficient. I was getting into the flow, that strange state where the pain in my back recedes into a dull, manageable hum and the world outside the radius of my mop ceases to exist. I was just a woman, a floor, and the relentless pursuit of cleanliness. I reached the edge of the area Professor Eris had pointed to. I had only been mopping for a minute, perhaps less, but the silence in the room was beginning to feel heavy, almost suffocating. I kept my head down, ready to move to the next row, ready to continue my work until every inch of the room sparkled with the clinical indifference of the institution. But then the rhythm was broken. "Maria," the professor's voice rumbled, low and resonant, cutting through the sound of the wet mop like a bell in the fog. I froze. The mop remained pressed against the floor, a dark stain of water spreading around it. My heart, which had finally found a steady beat, gave a sharp, painful leap. I did not look up. I waited for the critique. You missed a spot, Maria. The water is too dirty, Maria. You're moving too slowly, Maria. I braced myself for the correction, my posture already curving into the familiar shape of an apology. I was ready to be the failure they expected me to be. But the silence that followed his voice was not filled with anger. It was filled with something else. Something that felt like a shift in the air. A crack in the polished divide I had spent my whole life respecting. Stop now, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. Leave the mop, Maria. I looked up then, my eyes wide and blinking against the light. He wasn't looking at the floor. He was looking at me. And for the first time in 64 years, the gaze of a man in power did not make me feel like a smudge. It made me feel like a person. And that, more than anything else, was the most terrifying thing of all. Maria, stop. The words were not loud, yet they reverberated through the vaulted ceiling of room 302 with the force of a thunderclap. In the microcosm of my world, a command like that was usually the prelude to a storm. I froze mid-stroke, the heavy cotton mop pressed against the linoleum like a leaden weight. Time seemed to coagulate, turning into a thick, suffocating syrup that made every breath a labor. I didn't move. I didn't even dare to blink. I just listened to the sound of the soapy water as it escaped the gray fibers of the mop, drip, drip, drip. A rhythmic metronome of my own impending failure. Panic, cold and sharp as a winter needle, flickered in my chest. Have I done it wrong? My mind raced through a frantic catalog of potential sins. Perhaps the bucket had left a ring on the tiles. Perhaps the scent of the ammonia was too pungent, offending the delicate sensibilities of the scholars gathered here. Or maybe, in my invisibility, I had accidentally stepped into a space where my shadow wasn't permitted to fall. I felt the familiar curvature of my spine deepening, my posture instinctively carving itself into the shape of a defensive apology, the stance of a woman who has spent 40 years being told she is taking up too much space. The silence in the room became heavy, expectant, a physical presence that pressed against my eardrums. I could feel the weight of 100 gazes, the sea of bright eyes I had noticed earlier, now focused entirely on the blue-smocked intruder in the center of their sanctuary. I was a stain they were all forced to look at. I braced myself for the correction, for the sharp edge of a reprimand that would remind me of my place. I was ready to be the failure they expected me to be. Slowly, painfully, I lifted my gaze. I expected to see the professor's face clouded with irritation, his brow furrowed behind his silver spectacles. But when my eyes finally met his, the anger I had prepared for was nowhere to be found. Instead, Professor Era stood there with a terrifyingly calm expression, his stature still imposing, but his eyes were softened by a strange, unreadable light. Maria, he repeated, his voice dropping an octave, losing its lecture hall resonance and becoming something more intimate, more human. Leave the mop where it is. I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat feeling like a jagged stone. I'm sorry, Professor, I whispered, the words a reflex, a ghost of 1,000 previous apologies. I can move faster. I will be out of your way in a moment. I just need to finish this corner. No, he interrupted, not with harshness, but with a firm, quiet authority that brooked no argument. He stepped away from his lectern, moving toward me. The students watched, their laptops forgotten, their pens poised in midair. The air in the room felt electric, as if the very atoms were vibrating with the shock of a broken routine. He gestured toward the very first row of desks, the seats usually reserved for the most ambitious, the most eager, the most brilliant of his disciples. Please, he said, the word sounding alien in this context. I want you to come and sit here. In the front row. The request was so nonsensical, so outside the boundaries of the reality I inhabited, that my brain simply refused to process it. I looked at the chair. A sleek ergonomic thing of plastic and metal, and then back at my mop. The chair was a throne for the future. The mop was the staff of my servitude. To move from the latter to the former felt like an act of high treason against the social order of the university. Me, sir? I asked, my voice cracking. I have work to do. The floor is still wet. I shouldn't. I am dirty, sir. I looked down at my hands, still encased in the yellow latex gloves that smelled of chemicals. I felt the shame of my existence rising like a tide. I was a creature of the shadows, and he was asking me to sit in the light. "The floor can wait, Maria," he said, his voice as gentle as a hand on a shoulder. "Today you are not here to clean. Today you are here to be seen." I hesitated, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct I had honed for survival told me to run, to retreat back into the safety of the hallways, to become a ghost again. But there was something in his gaze, a profound, unwavering respect, that acted like a magnet pulling me forward. With a trembling step, I let go of the mop handle. It stood there for a second, balanced on its own weight, before slowly leaning against the bucket with a soft clack. I felt naked without it. It was my shield and I had just laid it down. I walked toward the front row, each step feeling like I was treading on thin ice. The silence of the students wasn't mocking. It was hushed, almost reverent. I reached the chair and paused, looking at the professor for one last sign that this was a mistake, a cruel joke I hadn't yet understood. He only nodded, a small, encouraging smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I lowered myself into the chair. The sensation was jarring. I was used to the hard, unyielding floors or the wooden benches of the staff break room. This chair was soft, supportive. It was a chair meant for someone whose comfort mattered. As I sat, I felt a wave of dizziness. From this vantage point, the room looked different. I wasn't looking at the feet of the students anymore. I was looking at their faces. I wasn't looking up at the professor. I was sitting in the space where his wisdom was directed. I felt a strange, terrifying warmth bloom in my chest. For a fleeting second, the cleaning lady vanished and there was only Maria, a woman sitting in a classroom, a woman who, for the first time in 64 years, was being treated as if she belonged in the front row of life. I looked up at Professor Eris, and despite the confusion, despite the lingering fear that this was too good to be true, a small tentative smile began to touch my lips. It was the smile of someone who had spent a lifetime in a storm and had suddenly, inexplicably, found a patch of sun. But the confusion was only beginning. The professor didn't return to his lecture. Instead, he looked at the class and then back at me, his expression turning solemn. "Now, Maria," he said softly, "I have one more request. Please place your hands on the table and close your eyes." The air in room 302 seemed to thicken, turning into a heavy, silent fog that pressed against my chest. I stared at the professor, searching his face for the punchline of a cruel joke, but his eyes held only a terrifyingly calm sincerity. He pointed again to the chair in the very front row, a seat usually occupied by students with bright futures and expensive pens, not a woman whose identity was defined by the gray water in a plastic bucket. "Please, Maria," he said, his voice dropping the booming authority of a lecturer and adopting the gentle cadence of a plea. "Come sit here." An incomprehensible command. In 40 years of labor, I had been commanded to scrub, to polish, to empty, and to vanish. I had never been commanded to sit. To sit was to claim space. To sit was to exist. To sit in the front row of a university lecture hall was an act so foreign to my existence that my legs felt as though they had been replaced by pillars of salt. I looked down at myself, a wave of acute burning shame washing over me. I was painfully aware of my uniform, the blue polyester smock that bore the faded stains of 1,000 different chemicals. I was aware of my shoes, scuffed and worn thin by the relentless miles of linoleum. I thought of my hands, those rough, calloused maps of labor, and the yellow latex gloves that still carried the sharp, clinical sting of ammonia. This room was a cathedral of intellect, and I was a smudge of dirt on its altar. I shouldn't, Professor," I whispered, my voice a dry rattle in the hallowed silence. "I am not clean. I will ruin the chair." "The chair is just plastic and metal, Maria," he replied, his expression softening further, becoming insistent yet profoundly gentle. "But you are a person, and today this seat is yours." The students were silent. 100 pairs of eyes watched me, not with the usual indifference, but with a quiet, breathless anticipation. I felt as though I were walking a tightrope across a vast canyon. With profound humility and a heart that hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, I began the long journey from the center of the room to the front row. Every step felt like a betrayal of the rules I had lived by. I was stepping out of the shadows and into the blinding light of the spotlight. I reached the desk, the uncomfortable throne, and hesitated one last time. This was the space of the engaged scholar, the place where ideas were birthed and futures were forged. It was not a place for a tired cleaner whose only legacy was a lack of dust. But the professor did not move. He waited, his gaze anchored to mine, offering a silent bridge of dignity across the chasm of our social standing. I lowered myself onto the perch. The sensation was jarring. The chair was designed for comfort, for support, for the long hours of academic pursuit. To my body, accustomed only to the hard bite of concrete or the fleeting relief of a wooden stool, the comfort felt like a provocation. I felt small and fragile against the sleek lines of the desk. I pulled my hands back, hiding them in the folds of my smock, terrified that the grit of my life would somehow contaminate the polished surface. I was a ghost sitting in a king's seat. As I settled, the professor stepped closer. He didn't look at the students. He looked only at me, as if I were the only student in the room, the only one whose presence mattered in that singular, suspended moment. The silence of the room was no longer a burden. It was a sanctuary. I looked up at him, my eyes swimming with a confusion that bordered on grief. Why now? Why me? Why on this day, when I had already resigned myself to being forgotten? The kindness was more painful than any reprimand could have been. It forced me to acknowledge the humanity I had spent decades trying to bury for the sake of survival. There, he said softly, a small sad smile touching his lips. You are where you belong, Maria. I didn't feel like I belonged. I felt like a trespasser in paradise. But as I sat there, the heat of the room seemed to seep into my bones, dulling the sharp edge of the ache in my back. For the first time in 64 years, I wasn't looking up from the floor. I was looking out at the world from the front row. And though the throne was uncomfortable in its novelty, it was the first time I had felt the sun on my face in a place that usually only offered me shadows. Now, Maria. The professor's voice drifted toward me, soft and resonant, like a low note played on a cello in an empty hall. Place your hands on the desk, palms up. And please close your eyes. The request was a tremor that shook the very foundations of my being. In the harsh, unforgiving world I inhabited, sight was not a sense. It was a survival mechanism. To be a ghost, one must always be watching, watching for the sudden spill, watching for the judgmental glare, watching for the obstacle that might trip you into the path of those who do not see you. Vigilance was the armor I wore over my blue polyester smock. It was the only defense I had against the indifference of the world. To close my eyes in this space, in the middle of room 302, surrounded by the elite and the educated, was to surrender that defense. It was to step into a void where I had no control, no warning, and no shield. It went against every instinct I had honed over 64 years of navigating the shadows. It felt like a betrayal of the woman who had learned to walk silently so as not to disturb, to watch the floor so as not to offend, to keep her back to the wall so as not to be struck by the carelessness of the living. I hesitated, my heart thudding a frantic, jagged rhythm against my ribs. I felt exposed, as if the very air in the room were peeling away the layers of my invisibility. I was a bird without wings, a soldier without a sword. The silence of the students, once merely a backdrop, now felt like a heavy weight, a collective breath held in anticipation of my surrender. But then I felt it. It wasn't a touch but a presence, a warmth that seemed to radiate from the professor and the sea of bright eyes before me. It was a heat that didn't burn, a light that didn't blind. It was the strange, impossible kindness that had already pulled me from my mop and bucket and placed me in the front row. It was a sanctuary I didn't recognize, but one my soul desperately craved. With a slow, agonizing deliberation, I reached out. My hands felt like leaden weights as I lifted them from the sanctuary of my smock and placed them on the cold, polished laminate of the desk. I laid them open, palms up, an offering of absolute trust to the unknown. In the fluorescent light, they looked like ancient artifacts. My palms were a map of a life I had never chosen, but had lived with every ounce of my strength. The skin was yellowed and toughened, etched with the deep, permanent grooves of 1,000 wringings of a mop. My knuckles were calcified monuments to the damp cold of winter hallways. There were scars there too, faint, silvery lines from broken glass I had cleared away so others wouldn't bleed. They were the hands of a servant, open and vulnerable in a place meant for masters. Then I did the most terrifying thing of all. I squeezed my eyes shut. The world vanished into a sudden thick darkness. The visual landmarks of my servitude, the bucket, the mop, the rows of desks were gone. I was alone in the blackness, my sense of hearing suddenly amplified to a painful degree. I heard the soft, rhythmic hum of the building's ventilation, a sound I usually ignored but now felt like the breathing of a giant. I heard the distant, muffled chime of the university clock tower striking the hour. And I heard the shuffling of feet, many feet, moving with a strange, purposeful quietness toward me. Panic flared again, a cold spark in the dark. Are they leaving? Are they laughing? Is this the moment the joke is revealed? I wanted to snap my eyes open, to grab my mop and run until my lungs burned. I wanted to retreat to the gray safety of the hallways. But the warmth in the room held me. It was like a physical hand on my shoulder, steadying me in the void. I stayed. I kept my eyes shut, my palms open and upturned on the desk, waiting. I was a vessel waiting to be filled, a ghost waiting to be named. I had spent my whole life making sure I saw everyone else. Now in the darkness I was finally allowing myself to be seen. I was an offering of flesh and bone and 40 years of dust, surrendering my sight to the grace of a world that had, for one miraculous moment, decided to remember my name. The darkness wasn't empty. It was full of a terrifying, beautiful possibility. As I waited, the smell of the room changed. The sharp bite of my own ammonia was replaced by something softer, the scent of sugar, the faint aroma of cocoa, and the inexplicable, overwhelming scent of humanity. I felt a tear escape the corner of my eye, tracing a slow, hot path through the deep furrows of my cheek. It was a tear for the 64 years of invisibility, and for the 1 minute of sight I was now surrendering to the light. The world beyond my eyelids has ceased to exist, replaced by a vast, pulsating void of expectation and terror. I am suspended in a vacuum of my own making, my heart a frantic, trapped bird beating against the cage of my ribs. The darkness is not empty. It is thick with the ghosts of 40 years of invisibility. I wait for the blow. I wait for the cold splash of water, the sharp sting of a rebuke, or the humiliating laughter of 100 students who have finally realized that the cleaning lady is a fraud sitting in a scholar's throne. But the laughter does not come. The rebuke remains unuttered. Instead, the air in room 302 transforms into something sacred. A sepulchral silence so profound that I can hear the soft, rhythmic expansion of my own lungs. It is a silence of reverence, not of mockery. Then the stillness is broken by the sound of shuffling feet. It is not the hurried, arrogant stride of the young and the purposeful. It is a slow, deliberate movement, a procession of gentle ghosts moving across the linoleum I had just polished. The sound is a soft, melodic friction, a collective pilgrimage toward the altar of my open hands. I am a vessel weathered and cracked, waiting for a deluge I do not understand. Suddenly I feel it. A touch so light it could have been the brush of a moth's wing. Yet it resonates through my entire being like a lightning strike. It lands on my left palm, the palm that usually grips the rough, splintered handle of a mop. For a fleeting second I flinch. My muscles, conditioned by decades of defensive posture, tighten in anticipation of pain. But the sensation is not a strike. It is a small, cool weight. It is a solid, rectangular presence, smooth and unapologetic in its tangibility. And then there is the sound, the distinct rustle of foil wrapper. That crinkle, so small and mundane, is the loudest sound I have ever heard. It is the sound of a luxury I have never permitted myself. It is the sound of sweetness, of a world that celebrates, of a childhood I left behind in the dust of 1,000 hallways. My breath catches in my throat, a sharp, jagged intake of air that burns like ice. The lump in my throat, which had been a dull ache, swells into a mountain I cannot swallow. It is not a reprimand. The realization hits me with a force that makes my vision swim behind my closed lids. I had walked into this room prepared to apologize for the very space my body occupied. I had spent the morning steeling myself against the cold indifference of a world that sees me as a function, not a soul. I had expected the urgent summons to be the final nail in the coffin of my dignity. But this weight, it is an offering. It is something else entirely. Another touch. My right palm, equally calloused and equally undeserving in my own eyes, receives a second weight. It is slightly heavier, perhaps a bar of chocolate or a small box of confections. Then a third. And a fourth. The shuffling feet continue their rhythmic dance, a steady stream of young lives pausing briefly before me to deposit a fragment of grace. I feel the texture of a ribbon's satin cool and slippery against my skin. I feel the sharp corners of cardboard boxes and the soft, crinkly plastic of candies. My hands, those weathered basins that have spent a lifetime carrying the filth of others, are being filled with the sweetness of the world. The weight is becoming substantial. It is the weight of acknowledgement. It is the weight of being remembered. Every small item placed in my hands feels like a stone being removed from the wall I have built around my heart. The cold laminate of the desk beneath my wrists is no longer a barrier. It is a foundation. I struggle to keep my eyes shut. Behind my lids, a kaleidoscope of colors begins to swirl. The gold of the foil, the red of the ribbons, the silver of the professor's gaze. I feel the warmth of a student's breath as they lean in to place their gift, a brief, human heat that acknowledges my existence. They are Memenusiacan minutia, humanizing the human, not through a grand lecture or a philosophical debate, but through the simple tactile language of a gift. The irony of the day is a bitter, beautiful pill. I am 64 years old. I have been invisible for more years than these students have been alive. I have lived through the betrayal of time and the slow revenge of age. I have been the ghost in their machine. And yet, here in the silence of room 302, I am experiencing a redemption I never thought to ask for. My hands begin to tremble under the mounting weight of the kindness. I am terrified that if I move, the mountain will collapse. I am terrified that if I open my eyes, the room will be empty and the chocolate will be dust. But the weight is real. It is a physical anchor in a world that has always tried to drift away from me. I feel a tear, hot, heavy and undeniable, break free and trace the deep mapped furrows of my cheek. It is a tear for the girl who forgot her birthday. It is a tear for the woman who learned to love the shadows. It is a tear for Maria, who is finally, painfully, being brought into the light. The shuffling continues, a steady heartbeat-like rhythm of grace. I am no longer just a cleaning lady. I am a woman holding a harvest of kindness, and for the first time in my life, the weight I carry does not make me want to bow my head. It makes me want to rise. The first weight had been a shock, a singular spark in the cold darkness of my expectations. But what followed was not a spark, it was a deluge. Another touch. Another weight placed gently beside the first, as if my hands were a fragile porcelain altar that might shatter under the slightest haste. Then another and another, until the rhythmic sequence transformed into a breathtaking cascade of benevolence. I sat there, eyes squeezed shut against the world I thought I knew, while a new one was being constructed piece by piece upon my very palms. I could hear them now, not just the shuffling of feet, but the intimate human sounds of a crowd moved to silence. I heard the soft intake of breath from the students as they approached, a chorus of sighs that spoke of a shared quiet reverence. For the first time in my life, I felt the warmth of their bodies near mine, not as a threat to be avoided, not as a superior force to shrink away from, but as a gentle proximity of equals. They stood close enough for me to smell the vanilla of a girl's perfume, the crisp laundry scent of a boy's sweater, and the faint earthy aroma of the campus rain. Each person who drew near felt like a sunbeam briefly warming the cold, damp stone of my existence. My hands were filling up, overflowing. The callous basins of my palms, which had spent 40 years catching gray suds and the discarded fragments of other people's lives, were now being overwhelmed by a different kind of harvest. I felt the smooth, cold surface of a large bar of Swiss chocolate, the light, crinkly texture of a bag of hard candies, the soft, velvety give of a small pouch. The stack grew taller, a precarious mountain of sweetness that I struggled to balance. My fingers, stiff with the onset of arthritis and the memory of winter mornings, curled instinctively to protect the treasure, a mother bird guarding a nest she never thought she would have. The sheer volume of these small gestures was a battering ram against the fortress I had built. For decades I had survived by being a ghost, by telling myself that I did not need, that I did not want, and that I did not matter. I had forged a suit of armor out of indifference and ironclad resignation. I believed that if I felt nothing, nothing could hurt me. If I expected no one could disappoint me. But this was an assault of grace. The armor around my heart began to crack. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but a slow, agonizing splintering. The heat of their kindness was melting the frost that had settled over my soul. Every time a new gift was added to the pile, I felt a jagged fissure run through the wall of my silence. I wanted to cry out for them to stop, because the beauty of it was becoming a pain I didn't know how to carry. It is easy to be strong when the world is cold. It is much harder to remain composed when the world suddenly, inexplicably, turns to gold. I felt the professor's presence nearby, a steadying anchor in the swirling sea of my emotions. I knew he was watching this transformation, this Memenusiacan minutia, in its purest, most tactile form. He was teaching them a lesson that no textbook could ever contain, that the woman who mops the floor has a heart that beats with the same rhythm as their own, and that her birthday is a day worthy of a celebration. The weight in my hands was no longer just physical. It was the weight of every hello I had never received, every thank you that had been swallowed by the wind, and every moment I had been looked through as if I were made of glass. It was the weight of 64 years of being a person, finally compressed into a pile of chocolate and ribbons. The dam that held back my tears was no longer a wall. It was a sieve. A sob, small and ragged, caught in my throat, vibrating against my closed lips. I was a child again, standing in a valley of sunflowers, feeling the world reach out to touch me with a kindness I had long ago decided was a myth. As the last student stepped forward and placed a final, light gift atop the mountain in my hands, the silence in the room changed once more. It was no longer expectant, it was fulfilled. I sat there, a woman of 64, dressed in the blue smock of a servant but holding the treasury of a queen, waiting for the courage to open my eyes and face a world that had finally, miraculously, decided to see me back. "You may open your eyes, Maria." The professor's voice was no longer a command. It was an invitation to a world I wasn't sure I was brave enough to inhabit. I struggled to obey. My eyelids felt heavy, glued shut by a mixture of salt, sorrow, and a terrifying crystalline hope. I feared that by opening them, I would shatter the fragile glass of this moment, that the warmth would evaporate like a desert mirage, leaving me alone in an empty room with nothing but my mop and the crushing weight of my own invisibility. Slowly, I let the light seep in. At first, it was a blinding silver glare that burned my salt-rimmed eyes. I blinked, and the world began to coalesce into shapes and colors I hadn't seen in decades. My vision was swimming, a blurred and distorted lens through which the reality of room 302 struggled to manifest. Through the watery veil of my unbidden tears, I looked down at my hands, those weathered basins that had known only the gray grit of labor. I gasped, a small choked sound that died in the hush of the room. There it was, a literal mountain of chocolate bars, candies, and small ribbon gifts piled high in my palms. The colors were an assault on my senses, vibrant reds, shimmering golds, deep purples, and electric blues. It was a kaleidoscope of kindness. The sheer volume of it was staggering. The pile reached nearly to my chin, a precarious tower of sweetness that seemed to defy the laws of gravity. I saw the familiar gold foil of a chocolate bar I had only ever seen in shop windows, the delicate crinkle of artisanal wrappers, and small hand-tied bows that spoke of a care I hadn't experienced since my mother's hands last touched my hair. I was no longer just a cleaning lady. I was a living monument to an unexpected grace. I lifted my gaze, my eyes still searching for the catch, the joke, the hidden cruelty. But as I looked up, I didn't see a sea of indifferent scholars. I saw a sea of faces, each one transformed. The masks of academic detachment had fallen away, replaced by expressions of such profound, unfiltered warmth that it felt like standing before a furnace. They were smiling, not the polite passing smiles of people who see a function, but the radiant inclusive smiles of people who see a sister, a mother, a human being. And then a sound began to rise. It wasn't the shuffling of feet or the murmur of conversation. It was a melody. One by one, their voices joined together, a rising tide of harmony that filled every corner of the vaulted ceiling. "Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you." The song was a physical force. It vibrated in the air, pressing against my skin, sinking into the marrow of my aching bones. They were singing for me. For Maria. For the woman who had spent 40 years erasing their footsteps. The realization hit me with the force of a tidal wave. They knew. They had seen the calendar I thought was forgotten. They had looked past the blue polyester smock and the bandana. They had recognized the silent 64-year-old heart that beat beneath the surface of my servitude. I felt the last of my defenses crumble. The ghost in the machine was dead, replaced by a woman who was being celebrated by the very world that had ignored her. I looked at Professor Eris, who stood at the center of this beautiful cacophony, his own eyes shimmering with a quiet, triumphant joy. He nodded once, a gesture that said more than 1,000 lectures on ethics could ever convey. I tried to speak, to offer some fragment of gratitude, but the words were drowned in a fresh surge of tears. I could only sit there, my hands overflowing with chocolate and my heart overflowing with the light I had long ago given up on finding. I was no longer invisible. I was held. I was seen. I was humanized in the most devastatingly beautiful way possible. The blurred vision of warmth was the clearest thing I had ever seen. In that moment, the 64 years of shadows didn't matter. The only thing that was real was the song, the smiles, and the mountain of sweetness that I now possessed. A harvest of kindness from a world I finally felt I belonged to. The song faded, but its resonance remained, vibrating through the mountain of chocolate and gifts I held against my chest. The silence that followed was not the hollow, cold silence of an empty hallway. It was a warm, breathing stillness, a collective embrace that held me upright when my own knees threatened to buckle. I stood there, or rather I sat there upon that front row throne, and felt the tectonic plates of my reality shift and shatter. The realization hit me with the visceral force of a physical blow. They saw me. It was a thought so simple yet so devastating. For 40 years I had perfected the art of being a transparency. I had walked through these halls as a ghost, convinced that my only value lay in my absence, in the absence of dust, the absence of stains, the absence of a voice. I had become the blue polyester of my uniform, a functional object designed to reset the world for the real people. But in the reflected light of 100 smiling faces, the uniform dissolved. They didn't see a cleaning lady or a service worker. They saw Maria. They saw a woman with a birthday, a woman with a history, a woman whose existence possessed an inherent, unshakable dignity. The emotions I had suppressed for decades, the suffocating loneliness of the dawn shifts, the biting hunger for a simple hello, the deep-seated desire for connection that I had buried under layers of industrial bleach, burst forth with a violence I could no longer contain. A sob, ragged and ancient, tore itself from my throat. It was the sound of a dam breaking after a lifetime of holding back the tide. I wept openly, my shoulders shaking, my tears falling onto the foil wrappers of the chocolates, turning the mountain of sweets into a shimmering, watery landscape. I wasn't crying because I was sad. I was crying because I was being found. Professor Eris stepped forward, his presence a steadying warmth. He placed a hand near mine, not to take the gifts, but to acknowledge the weight of the moment. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, resonant anchor that echoed not just in the vaulted heights of room 302, but in the very marrow of my soul. "We must always remember Maria," he said, his eyes scanning the room to include every student in his grace, "that our purpose here is not just to learn, but to memenousiak in minutia, to humanize the human. No matter the profession, no matter the title, every person carries a spark of the divine. Because in the eyes of God, all humans are equal in their dignity and their worth." The words were a benediction. They stripped away the hierarchy of the university, the divide between the scholar and the servant, the polished and the stained. In that moment we were simply a room full of people, breathing the same air, sharing the same light. I looked at the students, these young people whose footprints I had spent years erasing, and I felt a profound, overwhelming love for them. They had given me more than chocolate, they had given me back my name. I stood up slowly, my movements no longer dictated by the weary rhythm of servitude, but by a new trembling strength. I gathered my mountain of gifts, cradling them like a child. I looked at my mop and bucket, standing abandoned in the center of the room. They no longer looked like my prison, they looked like the tools of a noble craft. I had spent my life cleaning the world so that others could see clearly. Today the world had cleaned its eyes so that it could see me. "Thank you," I whispered. My voice was small, but it was firm. It was a voice that belonged to a person who existed. "Thank you for remembering me." As I turned to leave, the students parted like a sea of light. I walked down the aisle, no longer shrinking against the walls, no longer lowering my gaze. I held my head high, the mountain of gifts a shield of joy. I reached the heavy oak door and paused, looking back one last time at the room that had transformed my life. The professor offered a final, respectful nod. The students were still smiling, their faces a testament to the beauty of a small planned surprise. I stepped out into the hallway. The transition was different this time. The long echoing corridor was no longer a tunnel of shadows. The sun was streaming through the high arched windows, turning the dust motes into a golden rain. I walked into the light, my footsteps no longer a lonely echo, but a steady, purposeful beat. I was Maria. I was 64 years old. I was a cleaner of floors and a keeper of the light. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't walking toward a job. I was walking toward myself. The shadows had been my home for so long, but as I walked toward the exit, I felt them fall away like a tattered coat. I stepped through the great iron gates of the university and into the city. The air was crisp, the sky was a brilliant, defiant blue, and the world was full of people. I looked at them and I knew that they too had names. They too had birthdays, and they too deserved to be seen. I walked home, my heart light, my hands full, and my soul finally beautifully restored. The symphony of dust had ended, and in its place a new song had begun. A song of dignity, of equality, and of the profound, simple grace of being human. Thank you for walking through the shadows and into the light with Maria today. It is a humble reminder that no one is truly invisible when we choose to look with our hearts. Have you ever experienced a small act of kindness that changed your perspective on life? I would be honored to read your stories in the comments below. If this journey touched your soul, please consider subscribing to Queen's Revenge, so we can continue to humanize humanity together.